Testing. Yep. Well, good morning. Good to see each of you here this morning. We will be looking at our second in a series of 2 Bible and science lessons. This one having to do with the flood of Noah. That's always kind of a weird moniker because it's actually not his flood, but the flood in his days, right? So, Noah's Ark, that makes sense because he actually built the thing, but I'm going to try and keep a little time at the end again. My notes are shorter. I've been a little more selective. There is a ton of stuff that could be addressed relating to the flood, the Bible, and science, and I've tried to pick a few highlights that I find interesting and compelling, and yeah, hopefully we can get through this and even have a little time at the end for some Q&A if you like. Yeah, I know I said that last time. But this time my notes are shorter, so I do have quite a few pictures to get through. So you're no doubt familiar with the biblical description of the flood, that it was catastrophic, that it was worldwide. And I think it begs a couple of questions. One, how could it happen? If you look at the processes that are going on today, this is not something that would ever happen. And secondly, what's the scientific evidence, or some of the scientific evidence that this has actually happened? So those are a couple of questions I want to look at with you this morning, hopefully quickly. Just a little more on that first question. How could such a flood happen? This is a map of the U.S. that shows what the shoreline would be if all of the ice caps completely melted. So all of the available water was in the oceans. And as you can tell, it doesn't make much of a dent. We lose most of Florida, some of the eastern seaboard, but it doesn't come anywhere close to covering the North American continent, right? So we hear all these dire predictions about global warming and ice caps melting, and okay, so if that were to happen, we still don't have a flood that is significant compared to the biblical description of Noah's flood. So processes that we see going on today cannot explain what the Bible describes. The Bible describes a world pre-flood that's different from the world we see today. And science acknowledges some of this. For one thing, the Bible describes a single continent. How do we know that the Bible describes a single continent? Nobody flew up in the air and looked down. We do have a description in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 6 that this giant spring in the Garden of Eden, King James calls it a mist, because they weren't sure back then what the word was. We do know today is a spring. It flowed out of the garden, split into 4 rivers, and watered the whole earth. You can't do that if you've got continents separated by oceans. So it seems that even the biblical description fits with that. And actually, you can see how the continents at one time could have fit together. Secular scientists are aware of this too, often refer to this original continent as Pangaea. That's a very different world than what we have today. I'll go ahead and throw this up there too. We have an interesting fossil connection between the continents. Layers of rock that can be traced from one continent to another, and we can trace them by the fossils that are in them. Peculiar fossil items, and you can see here, I'm not going to even try to pronounce some of those scientific names, some of those beasts, but we've got rock layers with those fossils in them, and they're connected. I mean, today they're separated by an ocean, but you can start in South America, stop at the ocean, pick it up in southern Africa, the same rock layers again. So just a little more evidence, I think, that originally the continents were connected. The Bible describes waters above the atmosphere. Genesis 1:7. That's the description of creation day 2. And what God did was create the sky, the atmosphere. And he specifically says he separated the waters below from the waters above. Creation, young earth scientists argue at length about what this looked like. At the end of the day, we don't know. Was it an actual liquid water bubble that encompassed the earth? Was it some kind of water vapor? How thick was it? This is a possible estimate. As I understand it, about 50 miles up, even today, there is a layer of very large water molecules up there, but it's not something that's there anymore, apparently. The description of the flood, we have the windows of heaven, is how it's described, opened, and the water fell. So it's not there to test. It's a very different world than what we have today. Today you send a rocket up, and it goes through all the different spheres and eventually hits outer space. No water. Yeah, the schematic is not to scale. This has got a 50-mile atmosphere and then about a 100-foot water layer. It's an estimate, and nothing particularly compelling about those numbers other than it seems like it would work. Although how you keep a bubble of water up there like that? Is it liquid? Is it gas? Is it ice? What mechanism? I have no idea. There's no way to test it. But it seems like there was something like that based on the description of day 2. There are young Earth creationists. I don't want to spend the day poking fun, but that think this is a water. I don't even know what word to use. That was pushed to the outer limits of the universe at this time. Yeah, I know. I do the same things, but there's all kinds of theories out there, and there's problems with each one, I think, or possible. So, Brent, did you have a question? Did you have a question, Brent? No, okay. There were also waters below the surface of the earth. This massive, spring, aquifer, I don't know what you want to call it, that fed the Garden of Eden, and flowing out from the Garden of Eden, split into the 4 rivers. Genesis chapter 2 gives us a description of that. This is referred to at the time of the flood as the fountains of the great deep broke up. And this seems to have been part of the catastrophe. Again, this is a feature mentioned in the biblical text that no longer exists, so it's difficult to evaluate it. You can't go test it today because it's not there anymore. We know of, we have our aquifer here in Nebraska. We know of kind of a little bit similar type things, but this one apparently is gone. Again, just to make the point that the world described in the Bible prior to the flood is different than what we see today. The Bible tells us that it was radically changed because of the flood. Description of the flood, just briefly: the water covered all the mountains by 15 cubits, roughly 45 feet. Sorry, that's not the right number. 20 feet. Cubits, 18 inches. 15 cubits, 21-ish, 21 and a half. But anyway, covered all of the mountains, so there was no dry land, and killed all the land animals and the birds. Does not mention the fish, but the land animals and birds and people. So it describes it as global, worldwide, catastrophic. Nothing like it before, nothing like it since. I see that hand. So I'm just about to jump into rocks here. I can't give you a percentage. Almost all of the mountain ranges that we have today are composed of sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock is rock laid down layer by layer in water, by water. The Himalayas, Mount Everest, the Rocky Mountains. Name a mountain range. They're composed of sedimentary rock, with the exception of a few volcanoes, and some metamorphic too, which began as sedimentary rock. So the mountains that we see today are actually result of evidence of post-flood. We don't know how high the mountains were pre-flood. So any 14,000 foot peaks, I'd be a little surprised. As tall as Mount Zion, well, that's easy. So, yeah, I can't really answer that. We just don't have much of a description other than the waters covered them. So I would assume from scientific evidence that Mount Everest is a post-flood mountain. It's composed of sediments laid down by the flood, and it was pushed up in the activity during or shortly after the flood. I should have put this up without the picture and just asked if anybody knew what are the 3 types of rock, and I've already named them. But there are 3 categories. Igneous, which is lava type rock, basalt, obsidian, some things like that. Another kind is sedimentary rock, which is water laid. And the third kind is metamorphic, which is sedimentary that has been compressed and heated and changed, metamorphized into a different consistency. So the vast bulk of the rock that you see today is sedimentary rock. And it is, limestone is most of what we have around here, and that's true across the world. And that is sedimentary rock. It's been water laid, and any geologist would tell you that that is its source. You can see the stratification in it, you can find fossils in it, all that kind of stuff. One of the interesting things about sedimentary rock is that we find things like this, where the rock has been pushed up, rolled, folded, those kinds of things. And pretty clearly this was done while the layers were still soft. Because you can't get this kind of form with rock that's been completely hardened. It doesn't do this. I think that's pretty convincing evidence of Noah's flood too. These layers do not represent 300,000 years or 1,000,000 years, and then they got crunched a little bit. That has to happen while they're still soft. It looks fluid, yeah. And you guys have seen this kind of thing. You ever been out to the Rockies or Grand Canyon, or it's all over the place. There are places where it's just straight. Well, the layers are intact. You often find them tilted, sometimes at an acute angle, but yeah. Just another picture of a larger mountainside to show you the size of some of these folds in the sedimentary rock. We have fossils in just a whole lot of these rocks, these sedimentary rocks. Here in Nebraska, you can often find sea creatures, the little crinoids, which are kind of a starfish with a stem kind of animal, shells all over. Some of the sedimentary rock is fairly clean, but a lot of it has a lot of fossils in it. To be preserved, fossils have to be buried quickly. You can't leave an organism exposed and expect it to become fossilized over eons. It doesn't happen. They disintegrate, especially larger organisms. But even true of plants. The coal beds that we have today are massive piles of vegetation that have been compressed under these layers and have turned to coal, and it still has vegetal material in it, and BTUs. You can burn it. We do that all the time. But they're composed of plants, and we find plants in them on a regular basis. This is an old picture of a root ball that was found in a coal seam. It's actually dropped out of the layer right above the coal seam. Can you see the hole in the roof behind this I hope nobody got killed. This massive, today they call them a kettle bottom, was in the rock layer right above the coal bed, and when they took the coal out from underneath, it fell down. This is a picture of one of those cut through the side in an open pit coal mine. It's a tree stem, and you can see the layers of sedimentary rock that it goes up through. That is a clear signifier that these layers were all laid very quickly. They're in sequential order, but they were laid very quickly while this log was standing there. Not hundreds of thousands of years per layer. Yeah. A small flood in that area. But then by extension, if that's true in a small area, how do you say it's not true everywhere you find all these thin layers? Hmm. Yeah. And this is not a unique picture by any means. I've actually, with my own eyes, seen this kind of thing in a quarry, and it's pretty amazing. Um, here's a. You guys ever have or see horsetail around here? They're kind of a jointed. They almost look like a reed. We've got some around our place. They're kind of a pest for farmers. They like wet areas to grow in. Yeah, they're usually about as big as my pinky. Snake grass, you call it? Okay, okay. This is a giant, a section of a giant version of that, and it actually is coal, just to demonstrate for you that coal is composed of vegetation, plant matter. Another chunk of coal where you can actually see some of the ferns and other debris that make it up. Hmm. Yeah, yeah, very large stuff. Yeah, yeah, plants that we know today that are 3 or 4 feet tall, you can find spitting images in fossils or in coal beds that are 10 times that easily. They just don't grow that big today. Um, Essentially, the same thing can be said of oil fields. Uh, Crude oil is one of two things. It's usually considered to have some kind of animal material in it. It can also be created from coal. They can do that in the lab. They can take coal and create crude oil out of it. I don't know exactly what the process is, but they're actually pretty similar. Um, I mentioned on that slide there porphyrin molecules that are a type of molecule that's only found in plants, in chlorophyll, and in animals in hemoglobin. So, you know, it's not found in any other place, any other kind of organism. So that's kind of a clue too, that oil fields are also the result of massive beds of plants or animals or even both. Yeah, a lot of uses for it. Uh-huh. That's true. I'll show you a picture here. I did think ahead on this one just a little bit. Do you notice anything about the stones in this photo other than the fact that they're moss covered? They're smooth and kind of rounded. How does that happen? Water, erosion, current. Yes, they've been tumbled. Any of you ever have a rock tumbler as a kid? You can create miniatures of these, and if you got the right stone, they're really pretty. Yeah, these have been tumbled. So what's going on in this picture? Amazing, huh? Whoa, 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 whoa. Pulling a prank. I just think that's an amazing natural phenomenon, right? And then I ran across this picture and sort of burst my bubble. But all this is actually going somewhere. Look at this. An island called Virgin Gorda, the British Virgin Islands. You can see the people on the beach. You can see the stones both in the foreground and in the background are huge and tumbled. Yeah. Now, the photo I showed you earlier was in a stream, and you could imagine that these tumbled down the stream over the eons. Where do these come from? This is an island. There are no large mountains around here. How did these stones get tumbled and washed up? And they're huge. Some of these stones are larger than a house. And there's no upstream from which they could have been washed. I don't get tired of looking at pictures of this stuff because it inspires awe. Here's a guy rock climbing under one. But two massive rounded tumbled boulders and a chunk that's been washed up and set down right in between them. This is not a natural erosional pattern, guys. These things have been washed in here in some massive flood event. If it wasn't for the houses here, the buildings, you might think this was a shot of 3 or 4 square feet on a beach. And then you look at the buildings and the swimming pool and you're like, wow, those are some big rocks. And they're all tumbled, rounded, if you will. An entire hillside of these things. And no place for them to have tumbled down the hillside from. I have an answer for this. There was a flood, a worldwide catastrophic flood. Yeah. Okay. I want to show you one more thing, which is soft tissue in dinosaur bones, which tells me that dinosaurs were buried fairly recently and that they were buried very quickly. I've had some dogs in my life and probably innumerable cats. And you couldn't find soft tissue today from any of them. Well, we got a couple that are still alive, but the ones that have passed. Because natural processes have ensured that there is no soft tissue left after a year in those beasts. Amazingly enough, with dinosaur bones, we do still have soft tissue. This made a splash at the time it came out, and since then it's gone under the radar. It's not a single event, by the way, but this is the first one. A Tyrannosaurus rex skeleton that was discovered, I believe, in Montana. Yes. And if I recollect correctly, in order to get the thing out, they had to break a femur because the helicopter couldn't lift the whole thing and the plaster cast around it in one piece. Normally, they would try not to break the bones, of course. But because they had, she was inspecting, Mary Schweitzer was inspecting the interior of the bone structure, and, well, she says, it was exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone. But of course, I couldn't believe it. The bones, after all, are 65 million years old. How could blood cells survive that long? So she finds soft tissue that looks like ligament, soft tissue that looks like blood vessel. Well, here, let me show you a few more pictures. That upper one, and this is from a T-Rex that's supposed to be 65 million years old. Soft tissue connecting two other pieces. I mean, even these are actual color, real life color. Some other structural material. Close up with a microscope. I mean, why would you not call that a blood vessel? Except for the fact that it's not supposed to be there. And they squeeze some material out of it. By the way, this gal, Mary Schweitzer, is not a believer. And she was as stunned as anybody else when she discovered soft material, soft tissue in these bones. Squeeze material out of it that looks for all the world like red blood cells. And by the way, they did a bunch of testing on this. And they have ways of introducing things to this kind of material that'll tell you whether it'll only attach to like collagen, which is an animal material, won't attach to something that looks like it but that's made by a fungus, that kind of thing, because she got accused of, well, that's just recent fungal material or something like that. And they have proved that this is actually original T-Rex material. Bone marrow-ish. I mean, it's been preserved in the center of the bone. In this case, we've got some others where it's actually outside of the bone. How's it preserved? Among other things, she found actual bone osteocytes, bone cells. I mean, it's what makes up your bones. When we talk about a fossil, what we typically are referring to is buried organism. Take a T-Rex. Everything, rock, mud, whatever, encases it, turns hard. Water slowly seeps through and takes out the original organic material, and that is infilled then by mineral. So when you dig up a fossil, you actually have a mineral imprint of the original. That's not the case here. Technically, this has not been fossilized. We refer to it as a fossil, but it's actually the T-Rex. Somebody asked me the other day about DNA. And of course, they've checked this for DNA. DNA is quite fragile, and they found traces, but not sufficient DNA to actually reconstruct this beast's DNA. No Jurassic Park yet. So they started, once they discovered this, they started looking elsewhere. If it's happened once, could it happen other places? And sure enough, they were able to discover something quite similar in other fossil bones. Across the sea, was this in Ireland? No, London, UK. They discovered this specimen, this claw, had been in their cabinet for a century, and yet when they poked inside, they also found soft tissue that had been preserved despite the fact that they dug it up and hadn't taken care of it. Another example, 2009, this gal, Maria McNamara, discovered actual muscle in a little salamander fossil. Show you a picture of what those little salamanders look like. I read her quote, and it is extremely obtuse, and I almost put it up here just to laugh with you at it, because she goes in a very roundabout way to say, we found preserved muscle tissue in this fossilized salamander. Point being, this isn't a one-time wonder. They have found this once they realized it was possible and started looking for it, they have found soft tissue preserved in dozens of different fossil specimens of many different kinds. The T-Rex was the first one, but they have since discovered it in many different places. Just show you a slide here with a few examples. The animals that they came from, a couple of T-Rex samples, Triceratops and Brachylophosaur. Yeah. That should be Brachylophosaurus. It does sound a little bit like broccoli. Anyway, Each of these lines shows you photos from that specimen, and it's all over soft tissue, blood vessel, blood cells, osteocytes, which are bone material. Yeah, I need to move on. Just to say, this kind of evidence, these things have not been there for 60 million years. Soft tissue doesn't last that long. There's no way. It's got to be much more recent than that, unless you have a firmly held belief, faith in the fact that Darwin's millions of years are necessary. If you want to believe that badly enough, you can explain this away somehow. But on the face of it, the evidence is these are not millions and millions of years old. And we do have some post-flood stuff. Ashfall up here in northern Nebraska, that's post-flood. Those barrel-chested rhinos were killed by and encased in ash from somewhere out, massive volcano, they think out in Wyoming. Now I think those are actually not true fossils like mineral, but are bone that's been buried. They call them fossils, and they would attribute millions of years to those as well. I wouldn't. The Mammoth site in Hot Springs, South Dakota, same thing. They're recent. They're not flood victims. Uh-huh. Yeah, mammoths are a fun one. In fact, as I understand it, the Native Americans have stories about fighting mammoths. But yeah, we find those, preserved well enough you could eat them if you were frozen. You like deep freeze. Frozen rapidly, yes, related to the Ice Age. And I don't have time to go into the Ice Age. It's a fascinating post flood, yeah, and there's solid evidence of the Ice Age, the ice cap here in North America that came down about to the Missouri River. Yeah, fun stuff that I don't have time to get into. I think this is my last point. There are flood stories from around the globe. Many cultures. This tablet is one example. The Nippur tablet from Nippur in modern-day Iraq records. You're all familiar with the Epic of Gilgamesh. That contains a flood story. In fact, these two tablets, one of which was actually found in Israel, record parts of the flood account in the Gilgamesh Epic. And I gave you most of this, just a brief list of some of them from around the world, different cultures that preserve flood stories. And by flood stories, I don't mean a local flood, I mean kind of a mythological world wiped out, one guy saved, or two people saved, or a family, or something like that. Everyone's a little different, but the point that I would take away from it is that it's not coincidence, but they're actually remembering an actual event that took place earlier. Yeah. People took the story with them. It was a big event in their collective memory. They were all related. Yeah. So why do evolutionary scientists reject the biblical account of the flood. I think one reason is that it can't be accounted for with processes that we can see today. You can't reproduce this, you can't test it. Now that's true of origins as well, but if your core belief is uniformitarianism, a catastrophe like this does not fit into that. So I think that's one reason. A second reason is because it implies that there's a God who judges sin. If you accept that there is a global flood and it can't be natural processes that we see today, what's the source? Well, the Bible attributes it directly to God as judgment for sin. And if you don't like the idea of God, that's not an acceptable thought. So I think that's a strong motivation for the rejection of some of this evidence. And last but not least, evolution needs the fossil record for a different purpose. If you explain the fossil record, if you attribute it to something like Noah's flood, and it doesn't represent millions and billions of years, evolution's got nothing. Despite the fact that we've not found missing links or evidence in the fossil record of gradual development like Darwin hoped, at least there is still a fossil record. And you can say, these old, these young. You take that away, and there's just not a leg left to stand on. And I think that's another reason why the evidence of Noah's flood is not accepted today by Darwinian evolutionists. We mentioned this last week, but I wanted to throw it up there once more because I think it's really apropos. Peter's words in 2 Peter chapter 3. Know this, first of all, that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation. When they maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the word of God the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and by water, through which the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded with water. But by his word the present heavens and earth are being reserved for fire, kept for the day of judgment and destruction of ungodly men. Any questions? Wow, 30 seconds to go. I see that hand. He's right. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a faith system, and it's very deeply embedded in our culture. Really, really. Yeah. Uh-huh. I mean, can you imagine? Can you imagine if the scientific community did decide to abandon Darwinian evolution as a theory? How much stuff would have to be changed? Every every textbook, every national park sign, every museum. I mean, it just goes on and on. Yeah. Well, my point was just that there's been a lot invested in evolutionary theory, so I wouldn't I wouldn't hold my breath on seeing a change. But yeah, yeah. But if you're open to an alternative, there's a lot of evidence out there. Doesn't get much play in the press that is itself biased toward billions of years in evolution. But if you're interested in it, there's a lot of scientists doing a lot of research on this stuff, and some very fascinating. And every once in a while, you get stuff pop up. It gets quashed eventually, ignored, death through ignoring. But like the soft tissue. So okay. Any others? Next week, we're going to jump into the book of Acts, Lord willing. I'm looking forward to that. Fun book. So let me close this with a word of prayer. Lord, thank you for your word. Thank you for the testament that you have left, even in the world we live in, of your own activities through creation and also through judgment. Pray that you would strengthen us in our faith, keep us faithful to yourself, help us to be unified, to love one another, to be doing what is good and righteous and not sinning. And pray that you would use us as salt and light in our world too, when we have opportunity to affect others and to share your word and your truth and your love with other people. I pray that you would help us to be bold to do that. And I pray that you bless our effort. Ask for your blessing on the service to come as well. In your name I pray. Amen.